All right, it's about 1:15, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. And at the moment, I'm screen sharing just a copy of our outline for today and our goal. We're just gonna do a welcome and greeting. Then Al's gonna lead us in some storytelling and also have a list of questions that we can pull from to ask him and he can answer. And then we'll do a few minutes of a break. And then we'll start talking about the 1980s. And then Lord willing and the creek don't rise, I think is the quote. We'll do some small group conversations and large group conversations. And I just want to make mention, I consider this outline flexible. So we're not going to be rigid on timing. If there's other stuff going on, we'll just go with where we're led, if that sounds good to everyone. And so for now, I'll ask you each just to mute yourselves unless you're the speaker or asking a question, just for quality of sound. And this is being recorded.
Do you want to open with prayer, Cayman, or do you want someone else to do it?
Dan's going to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Dan, it's all you. We're set to go.
Well, welcome everyone to our wisdom gathering of 1970s and 1980s. My name is Pastor Dan Koshel, and we are in the midst right now of a worldwide pandemic, and COVID-19 has gotten our attention. We have been unable to meet physically together at our beautiful church on Denver Street for almost 2 weeks now as a result of this. And so we are learning new languages and technology, and this is one of the ways that we're communicating through Zoom. And so it is a new world and a different time than 50 years ago that we are celebrating our 50-year anniversary. And we're so grateful to have people that were in the church in the 1970s and the 1980s to tell us their stories so that we can understand and then archive all of this. So if you are looking at this 50 years from now, you're probably thinking we're pretty what is that word? Antiquated? And but here we are, we're doing the best that we can, and looking forward to that. And so I would love to open in prayer before we get started. Loving God, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for calling into being this church called Metropolitan Community Church. Thank you for those folks who were brave enough to gather together over 50 years ago to form what is now a dynamic institution, church outreach light in San Diego and in California, and indeed in the denomination of Metropolitan Community Churches. Thank you for this time together. May you lead our conversation, and thank you for the history that we have that we can build on, bringing people closer to you and one another, as is our mission. Amen. All right, so I turn it over to Pastor Cademan, our Minister of Congregational Life, who is also learning to be our tech guru and helping us with our live stream services on Sunday mornings. And so we're so grateful for all of the talent that is here. So, Cademan.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks everyone for being here. Al, I would love to start you off with a question, which is, what are you most excited about to share with us from the 70s?
Well, thank you. Am I on?
You're on.
Okay, I'm on, yes. Well, it was an interesting time. Actually, I can talk to you about what was going on in 1969 when we began to hear about Troy starting a church in Los Angeles. And we began to hear things about that, about this Pentecostal minister, and it invited people to meet in his living room. And we were starting to think about, well, wouldn't that be nice if we could have Troy come down? So a member of the community went up to see Troy every Sunday and asked Troy when could he come down. And Troy said, well, rent him a hall and he would come. And in Troy's own words, much to his surprise, The next week, the person said to him, we rented a hall and this is when it is and this is when you're scheduled. So Troy came down to preach or to meet or talk with us. And that was the infamous meeting at the Hall of Chimes, which you've heard a lot about, the Hall of Chimes. But basically what that was a one-time event that Troy came to be with us. Well, of course, that just encouraged us to want to do more, to get Troy to come down and preach with us a lot. And so then we started talking with Troy on an ongoing basis about when can we get you to come down and preach for us and preach every Sunday. And then Troy said, well, find me a place to preach and I'll come down. And as it just so happened, I was in a small group of 10 or so people meeting in the parsonage, the living room of the pastor and his wife of Choice View United Methodist, and he was holding an outreach, a Christian fellowship outreach in his living room of the parson of Choice View United Methodist on 47th and Hilltop. And that was just a bold ministry of Reverend Ed Hanson, who was pastor of Choice View, which was also incidentally a largely African-American congregation. So it fell upon me to be the one to go and say to Reverend Ed, you know, we would like to start having church on a regular basis. Wonder if we could meet in your sanctuary on Sunday evenings. And because his service was Sunday mornings. And much to his credit, much to his courage, he said he'd take it to his board of directors, board of trustees, and ask them if that would be possible. And I do wonder how he did that. But I would imagine he approached it that there's a little band of Christians that need a place to have church, and we've got a church here vacant on Sunday evenings. And much to their credit, his board of trustees said, well, sure, we can share our sanctuary. It's empty anyway, and we could do that. And then I would imagine Reverend Hanson probably said to them, I'm sure, brothers and sisters, it makes no difference to you that these just happen to be gays and lesbians. I would like to have been a fly on the wall to see the reaction that occurred there. But they rose to their Christian legacy and agreed to let us do that. So we started in early 1970 holding regular meetings, regular services in Choice View United Methodist every Sunday evening. And so we then contacted Troy and said, well, Troy, we did it. We got a place. Come on down. So Troy found himself preaching in Los Angeles in the morning. And then, like the old circuit riding pastors of other years and other locations, he would jump into an old Volkswagen van that somebody had, and he'd bring half a dozen people, few people with him, and they'd come down, leave his services Sunday morning, come down, be at our place in the afternoon, and then we held services at Choice View United Methodist. So that was when we really were MCC having services, because we had regular services in our church, and we began to build and develop from scratch what became MCC San Diego. And I'd like to say, God must have been with us, because God knows, God did know. We didn't know what we were doing, so somebody must have known. And we began to form church. And then in the meantime, while all that was going on, Troy was forming the denomination in Los Angeles, forming the framework of what would ultimately become our worldwide denomination, in those days known as Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. Now I think it's called Metropolitan Community Churches. So he was forming the fellowship and was inviting, inviting us, and I believe maybe a group had started in San Francisco at that point. That would have been the other church. And of course, Los Angeles, the mother church. So they were also sort of forming this fellowship, this denomination as they went, starting with it. And they put together a format, an application to apply to become members of the Metropolitan Community Churches. And so we immediately got the application, filled it out, sent it in. And in that sense of the word, we became the first member of Metropolitan Community Churches. I enjoy having fun saying that didn't set all that well with MCCLA, but they were renamed not the first church, but Mother Church, as rightfully it should be, as they deserve that. And so we had Troy was preaching in LA in the morning and then was down here. And we continued to do that for quite some time, having those churches. Well, that began to get kind of tiresome for Troy. And so he, at that point, I guess I was in what ultimately would be named vice moderator of the board. I don't know whether we had that title at that time, but so Troy would come down and preach, and he'd say to me, you got to find a preacher, you got to find a pastor. So, and I would say, Troy, we're looking, we're trying, we do. Well, we had the best preacher in our opinion in the world with Troy. So looking was, depends on what you call looking. I mean, we were kind of looking, but we liked having Troy. And I like to say it jokingly, and Troy acknowledges this, that I would almost dread that Monday morning phone call that would come and want to know, how's it going? And he'd say, well, Al, what's happening? How's it going? Are you finding any? So finally, he sent somebody down here to sort of be our clergy leader, sent a fellow down here. And after about 3 months, we sent him back. And then we had Troy again. And we liked that. But ultimately, Troy and the Holy Spirit did prevail. And a wonderful paternal father figure, known as, by the way, Papa John Hose, had joined the fellowship. And I think he was from some other part of the country, but he came out to Los Angeles, and then he began to attend with us, and we found that he was available. And I think much with Troy's encouragement, Papa John came on down and began to preach for us, and we elected him to be our pastor. So I felt like Papa John was really the formative pastor that we had. And so we continued to be there at Joyous View, and yes, and Papa John Hose, wonderful person, yes. So he was exactly what we needed. We needed a father figure, a parent figure, and we had Papa John. And that went on for maybe, I think, a number of years, maybe 5 years. I'm not exactly sure. But we began to grow. We were growing leaps and bounds in spite of all we had to overcome. I remember one night when we came to church, there were 2 police cruisers parked in the parking lot, Joyous View parking lot, and parked in such a way in the 2 far corners that their headlight beams crossed in the middle of the parking lot, and we had to cross through the headlight beams of these two police cruisers to get in the front door. I would say it's safe to say that at that point in time, the police were not necessarily our friends. And that's an interesting story in and of itself as to how that evolved from the people in the establishment, in the city establishment and so forth. We didn't have very many friends. It was hard to find a friend. And we were actually, it was really audacious that a group of lesbian and gays would form a church, of all things, a church. You would think that would be the two things that are diametrically opposed to each other. And so we started it with the help of Reverend Hanson, making available a place for us to have it. And then we started growing with leaps and bounds. So it wasn't too many years later, maybe a few years later, that a young man arrived at the church, and we found that his name was David Farrell, and we spotted him as a person with real leadership capabilities. He came to our attention right away, and so we got to be friends with David, and we found out he knew a lot about church. He just happened to be the personal assistant to the founding bishop of the Roman Diocese of San Diego. He was Bishop Buddy's personal assistant and his right-hand man in a personal sort of way. And there's David on the screen. And so we began to take advantage of what this person brought to us. Knew a lot about churches, knew a lot about, but primarily from the Catholic background. And so he began to take on a leadership role in our church. And in those days, we had developed a position called deacon. And deacon was not full clergy. They were not licensed, they were not clergy, but they did ministerial things and helped us out. So we formed, so then we had Deacon David, and we formed groups. We formed deaconages, I guess they called them, or something. But then we formed groups, and we appointed additional deacons. And one of the early deacons was Deacon George Murphy, who we have named, who when he left the deaconage, he was granted the title of Deacon Emeritus, George Murphy. And he and his spouse, John Eberly, began to attend, I believe, maybe in about 1972, maybe 71, 72. And so the deacons started, and David Farrell was growing into his leadership capabilities, naturally emerged in a leadership position. And so he was also doing ministry as deacon. And we were, once again, we were growing, and we were getting bigger, and we were almost starting to fill the sanctuary of Joyous View United Methodists, and coming to their attention also that we were getting to be pretty large at that point. So at some particular point, now remember, during this whole time, Troy is still preaching for us, and I'm still getting those Monday morning phone calls from Troy that are getting more urgent with each Monday morning. So I'll never forget and Troy also had met and really liked David, and they had become just really good friends. And we had Troy's support in the work that David was doing and the work that our deacons were doing. and he was very supportive of what we were doing, the board of directors, and we were sort of forming ourselves as we went. And so I'll never forget that we held a meeting, and we voted David to be our pastor. I mean, it seemed to us like the thing to do. We didn't know, so we wanted David. I'll never forget that Monday morning with the excitement I had to tell Troy, well, Troy, we did it. We had a meeting. We called a pastor. And he said, you did? Who'd you call? I said, we called David Farrell. And, he loved David to death, but he said, you did what? You called a deacon to be your pastor? He's not licensed. He doesn't know credentials. He's a deacon. You called him to be your pastor? You got to be clergy to be pastor. Well, I said, then let's call him something else then. What can we call him? And said, well, worship coordinator. So at that point, I said, well, he's already our worship coordinator. So we'll call him permanent worship coordinator until we can. I said, well, Troy, I know you can figure it out. You figure out a way to do this. We'll figure out a way. He said, well, let's see what we can do. So, but with Troy and God on our side, Troy and God in that order on our side, Troy came up with getting him licensed. And so he took some courses, and he attended the Moody Bible Institute by correspondence, and he did other things. He had done a lot of this already when he was with the administrative assistant to the bishop of the Catholic diocese, and had taken courses and so forth. So with all of that under his belt, some more courses and so forth, Troy licensed him as clergy, and that cleared the way that we could therefore call him as our no longer permanent worship coordinator. He was now our clergy. And then he was our pastor. Matter of fact, he was our pastor. And I like to talk about that started what sort of eventually became the northward trek, the northward migration of David Farrell, bringing this church from Choya's View down in the south at 47th and Hilltop. Immediately, David started looking for a church building. He said, we got to have our own building. We got to find a building. We got to have our own church. And so we went looking. And sure enough, over in South Park, we just happened to find just the right size church for sale. And it was on the corner of Fern and Ash. And it was, I think, owned privately at that point by a private church group. And they either were moving on or whatever, but the building was for sale. And we started to figure out a way, what can we do to do that? And I kind of have a memory of something like maybe $55,000. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but sounds like probably in about that period of time, that might have been about right, but that would have been probably about $55,000 more dollars than we had. So, so David right away launched a building drive. And any of you who are around who are listening to this, it sure sounds familiar. How many, we've had more than a few building drives, each one very successful. So we went out on a building drive. And somewhere along those lines, a group of us decided that we should reach out to the greater gay and lesbian community. We should reach out. We should let them know we're here. We're the best kept secret in town. So we started, puts a whole new meaning to this, folks. We started a bar ministry. So a group of us, about 2 carloads of us, about 8 of us, we started going around to the bars Friday evenings. Every Friday evening we would form up. We printed ourselves some brochures. We welcomed them to church on Sunday morning, and we went around on our bar ministry. So, and that was an interesting thing too. Pat and Sandy can probably identify, well, they weren't bar people, so that wouldn't work. Sorry about it. I see them laughing at me. Any rate, that was not exactly where you would think you would go out promoting a church. Where else was there? That was the only sort of gathering of gays on a regular basis, was in the gay bars. And I'll always remember going to the Brass Rail and many of those churches, which were BJ's, which was credited with being the oldest bar in San Diego, I think, before it became the oldest gay bar in San Diego. And we went to all of those and went around handing out our papers and talking to the people, inviting them. And I can remember back, it wasn't all that amusing then, but I remember now amusingly, the look on the people's face, like, oh my God, here they come again. Here come the Bible thumpers. Well, we weren't really Bible thumpers. We were just meeting with other gays, and that was an interesting way that we went about making ourselves known. So after a few months, a few months, I think, of a building drive, we raised enough money that we could buy that church. And so we did. We got enough to make a down payment, and then they took back a note, and we paid on the note, and we moved to our first, and at that point, and still at this point, we were the first gay organization in San Diego ever to own our own property. So once again, we were audacious, and we were pioneers in doing the things we did. And I think it's because we didn't know any better. Probably if we'd known any better, we'd have been too scared to do it. But we went out and did it, and there wasn't anything David could see that he couldn't see could be accomplished. And under his able and capable leadership, we went out there and bought that church at Fern and Ash. And I think we stayed there. Well, we pretty quickly outgrew that church. And during that period of time, and others of you will know things about this, we were under attack from homophobics who did not like the idea of gays and did not like the idea of gays having a church and the idea of gays being audacious enough to even think that God loved us. This was radical theology, a radical position. And we didn't know we were radical. We were just worshiping. We were just having church. But we were under attack at Fern and Ash. People were riding by in pickup trucks with gun racks on the back of behind the seat, and throwing things at us, and threw all kinds of things, rocks, and finally, even I think at some point through a manhole cover through our windows and breaking our windows. So at that point, we knew we had to, so we would, every time we got a broken window, we would repair the window and cover it with plexiglass. And then if the plexiglass broke, we would cover it with thicker plexiglass. And David had such a way with words. He had such a way. And I'll never forget one of the sayings that I've always remembered. David said, while others dream of crystal cathedrals, he only prays for a plexiglass church. So, and you know that, and he had a way of bringing humor to some of the worst situations in the world. And we were following him, and we had faith that it would all work out. Well, pretty soon we had outgrown that church, and we went out looking again for another church. And lo and behold, we found a privately owned church building up on the corner of 30th and El Cajon. That's the church that many of us remember that we were at, I believe, for about 20 years. That was at El Cajon in North Park. And so there we were, branching out again and taking a really big leap of faith this time, because it was expensive. And so, and we didn't have a whole lot of equity in the church that we had. I think a very interesting thing happened in that move. A collateral thing happened in that move. And that is, it turned out that an African-American group were looking for a church building. Can you imagine that? Now, remember, we started in the largely African-American United Methodist at Joyous View. We were looking for somebody to sell our church to, and Reverend Bob Ard was his name, was pastoring a small group, and they needed a church. And so they, let me see, they were, he had a church he started. And so we did everything we possibly could to figure out a way that we could sell them their church. And they didn't have any money either. So we traded notes and deeds and all kinds of things. David was just a master at shuffling the cards and making them all come out right. And the fellow that sold us the church at 30th and El Cajon, I believe, ended up holding a note from Bob Ard and his church down on Fern and Ash. And I believe the name of his church was then, and still is, was Christ Church of San Diego, was the name of his church. And how propitious was that? Because our church we had the labels, the label on our church out in front were the letters MCC San Diego. So all Bob had to do was remove the M, and he had Christ Church of San Diego. So it was meant to be. And then we went on up to 30th and El Cajon and began to hold church up there. And that was a large building drive to acquire that church, because it was a big jump. But it was owned by a restaurateur in San Diego, largely, I think Middle Eastern food was what it was, his restaurant. Antoine Chic, I think the name of the restaurant was. And Antoine was the owner and owner of this church building. And David just mesmerized Antoine. Antoine was more equally in awe or amused. I'm not sure what he was. And once again, the audacity of this little group of people now coming to him and said, well, Antoine, we want to buy your church. We don't have any money. We own another church, but we have somebody who'll buy it. Will you take their note and do this, that, and the other? And we traded paper here and there and did this, that, and the other. And I think David just basically had Antoine mesmerized by the whole thing, that this little group of people would have the audacity to ask Antoine to sell us his big church building, up that beautiful building up there on 30th and El Cajon. And basically very little money transferred. Well, I guess at that point, some did transfer because we had some equity, but not really, because Bob Ard didn't have any money to pay us. And it all just worked out. And there we were. We had made the trek up from all the way from 47th and Hilltop by way of Fern and Ash. And then there we were uptown in North Park at 30th and El Cajon. Back to you, Cademan.
Thank you. Your timing is perfect and your stories are awesome. Have you happened to be able to see the chat box while you're talking?
No,
Great.
It's not on my screen, no.
I wrote a few questions in there and other people have comments. So I'm thinking I'll ask you a couple of questions from here. and then maybe you could speak to them, and then we'll have like a little break and then go into the 80s.
All right.
Does that sound good?
Mhm.
Great. So let me scroll up here. These comments are, most of them are my questions, and so you guys can all feel free to add them in the future, and I'll ask them out loud when we get a chance. I had asked Michael or Pat and Sandy if they had been deacons, and Michael said no. His primary volunteering was through admin positions. And one of my questions is, how many people did the building at Vernon Ash accommodate? Like, what was the attendance like, the occupancy?
I think we were somewhere at that point between 100 and 150, something
Okay.
about that size.
Awesome. Yeah. I haven't been to those buildings yet, and so I don't have any point of reference to look back on and relate them to where we are now.
Speaking of that, Fern and Ash had one center aisle, and we had pews on both sides. So we just had one aisle. So a figure of about 100 is probably in the ballpark. And then we had a sound booth in the back.
Okay, thank you.
Now that being the case, just to continue, offices were above the sanctuary, and we had a garage type building that served as the social hall, probably a little bit smaller than our current social hall. So just those two buildings, the upstairs for the office area, the sanctuary, and the social hall.
It sounds kind of like an ideal setup for that size community. That's awesome.
I see Pastor Dan has a question here about the style. Is that to me, Dan?
Yes, it is to you.
Well, the style was largely, I would say the style was just middle of the road, just middle of the road worship service. Probably that style was largely set by Papa John when he became our pastor. And it of course, as has been the history of MCC, had flavors of many of the backgrounds of the people who were attending. So we were primarily middle of the road Protestant. We had some Catholic influences, and some things that our Catholic members brought to us, some of which was probably sort of high Catholic, and marching in with a cross and those kinds of things. But it was middle of the road Protestant, I'd say.
There's another follow-up question. When was the Pillars Club formed?
The Pillars Club was formed by Reverend David as an outreach to people that might not always be attending in person, but were very supportive of us, wanted to be supportive of us, and wanted to have a connection. And I believe the Pillars Club formed out of the necessity to raise the funds to purchase 30th and El Cajon. So it was formed early, and it was formed about the time that we were purchasing that church. And the purpose, and Pat and Sandy, I believe, might have been even charter members of the Pillars Club, and they will probably even be able to speak to this if they know more about it. But it was the brainchild of David, Pastor David, and it was to be an outreach to not only to people that were there who were worshiping, but primarily to give people a way to be connected to the church that were not necessarily in attendance to the church. I'm sure Pat and Sandy can expound on that some.
We actually, my physician was a gay woman who did not have any belief in Christianity, but she really believed in MCC's outreach to a community that was hurting and often abused by religion. And she felt that they were a healing force. And so she had been a pillar for, I mean, the whole time that we were in the Pillars Club, she also was very financially involved in helping the church maintain whenever there was needs. She was right there to help with that. And I know that Pat and I felt that it was a way for us to go beyond our tithe, and in a way that was, we could do that regularly, on a regular basis, and not just when the need occurred, but have a fund in the Pillars that if something happened, that the roof leaked or a window got broken or whatever, there was a fund in the Pillars that could help with that.
And I believe Michael is a long-term member of the Pillars Club. Michael.
Yes. And one of my earliest memories is back in the day, just to be distinctive, the Pillars letter and envelope were printed on blue paper, matching blue paper, so that everyone knew that it was different when it came in the mail.
Yeah.
And it still has its own distinctive appearance. Pastor Dan sends out a Pillars letter every month still, and it's clearly labeled Pillars Club.
Yeah, right.
Way to keep in touch with not only those of us who attend regularly, like the ones who are here today, we're regular attenders, but we're also members of the Pillars Club. And it's a way to keep in touch, and we get this wonderful inspirational letter every month, and that's a connection also.
Back in the day when they had a lot of non-members that were members of the Pillars Club, we'd have an annual Pillars banquet, and that was huge. We took up that. It was usually at the Tom Ham's Lighthouse, and if you're familiar with their meeting rooms, they have a small one and they have a huge one, and it would fill up that huge meeting room, and all these people that I had never seen before, and they were just people that were supporters of the church. And one reason I joined the Pillars Club was I came from a church where we had we were supposed to pledge every year, and at that time there was no way to pledge at MCC. So I thought, well, I'll just do it through this Pillars Club. So I had no idea I was going to get a free meal out of the deal, but it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. I wanted to say something when you were talking about the liturgical business of the church or what the format. One time David Farrell told me something. He said that he knew that there were a lot of people that came from liturgical backgrounds in the church, and there were a lot of Pentecostals that went to the church. And so if he did a service and one of the Pentecostals said, oh, there was too much liturgy, and the same day somebody from the liturgical background said, oh, geez, there was too much hallelujahs and that kind of stuff, he knew that he was doing it just right.
Oh, okay, that's good. Yes. Right.
So, Reverend Dan, I think you asked the question about, was there a choir at Fern and Ash? And the answer is yes. That was the Joyful Noise Choir. And if memory serves, Al, didn't they produce a record album of the Joyful Noise Choir?
Yes, they did, and that record is still in existence. It's still around, and the copy I have that I inherited from my late spouse, it was actually signed by every member of the choir. And at some point, that was under the direction of Terry Wheeler. That might have been at 30th and El Cajon, but Terry Wheeler was.
No, he was Vernon Ash.
Well, he continued to be part of our church, didn't he? At 30th and El Cajon.
Oh, yeah, he was there.
Yes, he was there for a long time.
Yes, he was. Yes, correct. Yes.
How many choir directors have we had?
Oh.
More than we can remember. No,
No, actually, we lost a lot of them when the AIDS epidemic was really bad. And that just brought something that was just really heavy. Yeah, some really wonderful, wonderful men.
I remember Pastor Dan was the choir director when I first started at MCC.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know you've been around that long, Mark. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
but Pastor Tony was the main pastor. I've been around almost 15 years, so.
And
Pat and I have been going for 36 years.
And I remember a couple of the choir directors. As a matter of fact, one of the choir directors is now choir director of a church up the street from us, from where we are now. And I do not mean the church directly behind us up the street. I mean further on up the street. And his name is Frank. And I believe, Pastor Dan, you have some interaction with him from time to time with choirs. Is that right?
Yes. He is at the United Methodist Church on Claremont Drive.
Oh, okay.
And
At St. Mark's?
St. Mark's, uh-huh.
Oh, wow.
And we did a joint choir. It was very interesting. A few years ago, he invited our choir to join their choir, and we had a service all together for an ecumenical prayer service. So it was really neat. And his name is on the record that you have, Al. He was actually a part of that during that time.
Mm-hmm. Right, correct. That's right.
Right, Frank Williams.
Yes, yes, that's right.
Right. I think I do not think he is choir director there at St. Mark's. I think he is director of special music, the special programs. They have outside groups come in several times a year. But I don't think he's a part. I don't think he's the main musical director.
Anyway, Pastor Dan comes at the top of a heritage of fine choir directors from starting in the beginning to where we are now. So.
Right.
Was Ken Caton ever a choir director? I know he was in the choir.
He was on our administrative staff.
Uh-huh.
And I don't remember whether he was ever choir director or not. But he was on our staff, yes.
I remember at one of the Sunday services in the 80s that David came in and he said, he had just come back from convention. And he said, I just met somebody that wrote a hymn that was in our hymn book. And that was Marcia Stevens.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out Ken was her music teacher back in high school when she wrote For Those Tears I Dried, and he made sure that she got that thing copyrighted so that nobody could steal it, and somebody actually tried to steal it after she had it copyrighted. So
correct.
It was a good thing.
Yes.
Well, just never forget David had this kind of cute expression on his face. You think of the little old ladies that write these hymn books, but I just met one and she's young.
Speaking of choir directors, remember Terry Wheeler?
Yes, of course.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Huh.
Yes.
I don't remember him or her.
It's a him.
It's
A him.
Yeah, Terry was over at on 30th Street, and then separated from the church, moved out of town, as I recall.
Yes.
And I've got a funny story about him. He did come back to service there at 30th Street after several years. He comes up to me and says, "Do you remember me?" And I looked at him kind of funny, and it dawned on me that I did recognize his voice. I didn't recognize his face. He had changed, but I remembered his voice.
So interesting. Just all the changes that have transpired over the years. Courtney suggested a listening party for the record, and I have a record player, so we could do that. And then Dan's taking back remembering meeting Ken. I think it was Terry Wheeler who I met also when I was in the Assemblies of God, and he was with 3 men. Wow, a poly person from MCC back then. And I had you never had heard of MCC before. Yeah. How did you guys hear about it? How did you hear about MCC, Al? Or did you just generate it along with Troy? Did you hear about it somewhere?
Well, we heard about his ministry in Los Angeles. Because remember, he started, in his living room, I think in 68. So we began to hear about him in 69. And that was when we started to do something to try to get Troy to come down here with us.
So you were already part of an LGBT worshiping community, or just your peers and friends?
No, just a little group that was meeting in Reverend Hanson's living room every night for Christian fellowship.
Got it.
Yeah.
69 was a good year. That was the year I was born too, so.
That was a good year, Mark.
That's awesome. That's so good.
So was 38.
Seems to me that one of the ways of promoting the church was probably in the Advocate, the largest gay newspaper at the time. Subsequently, church started their own newsletter called The Prodigal. But seems to me that's how I became associated with the MCC, probably reading the Advocate.
Michael, Pastor Dan's asking if you and Al could say more about The Prodigal.
Oh, yes. I don't want to say I was the editor, but I put it together, and it's interesting. You're familiar with the term cut and paste?
Mm-hmm.
That's how we assembled The Prodigal back in the day. We printed out the text of the articles and used clip art and literally pasted it onto a large piece of paper, and then sent that to the printer to be printed. So this was during the day prior to word processors and computers. So the only technology that we had available was literally cut and pasted on
papers and scissors.
With scissors, yes.
Was there any complications like finding a printer to print an LGBT newsletter, or did you use maybe Patty Kennedy's printing company?
No, actually we used a gay printer in Ocean Beach.
Okay.
And that would be Don Hauk and maybe his family or his close friends. And so we were printing it in Don's print shop, which was also at that point putting out an additional gay newspaper, which he was the publisher of. And Michael might remember the name of that. Michael, do you remember the name of the newspaper that Don was publishing? But at some point, there were multiple papers starting, and almost as quickly, falling by the wayside, and you know, it was a tough business. You couldn't get advertisers, you couldn't get enough money. So I remember one group of us started a newspaper called the Pacific Coast Times. That was a lofty name for a little paper that we couldn't keep going. And I happen to know, a matter of fact, I'm friends with the woman who started and published for a while the Lesbian Times. And that was very early on, the Lesbian Times. And she's still alive and well and living in Golden Hills, as a matter of fact. I know her well.
Al, did we use Barbara Kreuzberg? Was she a printer for us at one time?
Well, that was much, much later.
Okay.
Later. And she did printing for us. I don't know, and I'm pretty sure she probably published our newsletter. I mean, she probably printed our newsletter.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. She was one of our long-serving board members.
Yes, absolutely, she was.
And one fond memory that I have of her, she could never say no. So whenever anything came up at the board meeting that required somebody to do something or leadership, everyone was silent, and then there we go.
Lee has a copy of The Prodigal.
There we go.
It's beautiful.
Yes, Barb always volunteered for extra duties.
She was so generous that David Farrell used to say, "Never leave home without her."
Aww.
Well, when we went to conferences and things like that, we always had Barbara.
Thank you, Lee.
Very generous.
Administrative people are often under acknowledged and underappreciated. Not in our church. We are so grateful for Lee at this point. But
Lee and Mark, when I was able to help before the pandemic.
It makes a big difference to have people doing the logistical work so that you can do other things. Al, when the church started, what was the mix between gay men and lesbians, and were there many heterosexuals also attending?
Cademan, what lesbians?
Sounds like it in the storytelling, yeah.
And
just
what,
Pat and Sandy.
And what straight people were there? And that's pretty interesting to me because in the very beginning, first of all, there were no children. Now talk about that rattling the cages of the homophobes. Can you imagine if we had children at a gay church? We had children, even though their parents brought them. So in the beginning, weren't any, and there weren't very many women. And the earliest couple that I remember that were really very strong supporters, and Pat and Sandy will know these two women, would be Jean and Eunice. And Jean was our treasurer, and her spouse was Eunice.
Yes.
And there was one heterosexual woman, and her name was Julie. And her husband was named Sarge, and they were a heterosexual couple. And I think it turned out later that it turned out Sarge was a trans man. So how about that? Our first heterosexual couple would have been a straight woman and a straight trans man. And they were very early in our church and stuck with us for a long time. Maybe Pat and Sandy remember when we had more women that were starting.
I remember when we first started going to 30th, that's when we had the theater seats in there. And all the lesbians sat together on the left-hand side toward the front. It was really funny. You know, the rest of the church was all guys, and the lesbians were all together. And so we sat with the ladies.
Yeah, right.
We also had a deaf couple that were a straight couple that came, and Bonnie was our signer then, and they sat in the front row. I can't remember their name now. Boy, a senior moment here. Sorry, guys. But yeah, they were members for a long time, and then when Bonnie left, then Carla took over. You know, it amazes me. Carla has been signing for 30 years.
Yes, yes.
It's amazing.
Yes. And she's a very accomplished signer.
Oh, yes, she is.
I see Carla at every big civic event that I go to.
Absolutely.
She's right up there with the mayor and with the city council and with everybody.
Yep, she really has been very, very faithful with giving of her time and effort. Yeah.
Yes.
Does anyone remember Dorman Owens?
Do we ever?
I want to hear. I want to hear.
we were.
Dorman was, as you might remember, he was pastor of something called Bible Missionary Temple. Can you imagine that? He got all the words in there. Bible Missionary Temple. He's the one who led the picketing of our church at 30th
Street, and then we had the Follies, which the whole gay and lesbian community would come out to, and it was a big deal. We had was it 2 nights, and we filled up that big auditorium at the Greenbrier Middle School.
Yes, it was. Yes.
And Sam made all those beautiful dresses for the trans or the transvestites that would dress up like women and sing, and some of them he could not recognize. They were guys that from the church. They dress up like a woman, and who is that? Who is that?
I know. And we're talking about my deceased spouse.
Yeah, Sam. Yeah.
And he designed and made not only their costumes but his own.
Oh yes.
He had these beautiful costumes of Pearl Bailey from Hello Dolly.
Yep.
And Diana Ross and Carmen Miranda.
Yep.
And he made all those costumes himself. His mother had taught him how to do that kind of thing growing up in the South in Baton Rouge, I think it was, in the South. And when I first met Sam, I met him at, we exchanged churches, we exchanged services with Dignity. That was gay Catholics.
Yes.
They were primarily meeting at, I think it's Christ
the King, maybe?
Christ the King. That's right, Michael. Christ the King. And I know so MCC went to support Dignity at Christ the King, and then Christ the King, then Dignity from Christ the King came to support us. And I remember having met Sam at that service we went to, and I thought, and he was the guest soloist at that particular time. So, by the way, your spouse David is on your screen with you there.
Yes.
Hi, David.
Hi, everybody.
It's great to see you.
Thank you.
But I remember part of the humor of all that is, I remember having met Sam at that event, and then when Dignity came to be with us, and that night when Dignity arrived, Sam was looking for a place to sit, and Jean and Junice, remember I mentioned those?
Yeah.
Jean and Junice? Well, they very graciously got up and moved aside, and that put Sam right beside me. And I think I remember, I can't imagine the surprise on Sam's face and the look of, At the least annoyance, like, oh my God, here he is, you know. But that night, I never let him get away that night. So that was back in the old days with Gene and Junice and all of us that we remember. So
wonderful tenor voice.
yes.
Wonderful.
That was just Gene you're talking about.
And then I was thinking of the Follies because at one of the performances, Dorman Owens and his little crew came to picket, and they looked like they were all in a line coming down the sidewalk, and they looked like a flock of ducks waddling along with their signs.
Yeah, that was so bad.
Yeah.
That was actually the only time that I cheered when I heard somebody went to prison. I was very happy to see him locked up.
That's right. And do you remember what he went to prison for?
Yes.
Yeah, bombing an abortion clinic.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. And the thing I thought was divine righteousness was, in those days I was in the federal courts a lot. I just about lived there. And I used to drop in on his trial and sit in the courtroom and listen to his trial. And the judge presiding over Dorman's trial was the first African-American judge appointed to the San Diego Federal District Court, Judge Gilliam.
Okay.
Was that divine right that happened?
Yeah, right.
Dorman down there looking up into the presiding judge is Judge Gilliam, just a famous person.
Now, wasn't his church out in Lakeside?
Either Lakeside or Santee.
Right.
Yeah.
Or Clan-T, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, Clan-T.
Exactly. So in other words, he had to go out of his town to bring his hate.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
And to bring his parishioners with him.
Yeah.
And so at some point, Reverend David put loudspeakers out on the front steps of our church and broadcast the service out to the picketers who were picketing. And somebody said to David, well, why'd you do that? He said, well, they weren't getting any Christian message from where they were, so at least they can hear the word of God here. So
right. Oh, and you know, I was involved in the Loaves of Love, and one of the families that live on that street started coming to our church because of the broadcast messages. He said, anybody that can preach like that is worth coming to church for. And he started coming with his whole family.
Wonderful.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to talk about is we now have the video ministry and live broadcast and everything, but we had one way back in the 80s, and it was mainly John Everly that was doing it, and then we were helping him. And there was somebody else, I don't remember who would take those. We would actually do the filming, and then somebody else would take
Eileen Budney.
Oh, that's right.
Eileen Budney would take the video to have it put into a I think a 16 millimeter format, so that it could be aired on television.
Public television.
Yes, and it was on channel. I think it was channel 15.
Yes, it was.
And we had that slot for years and years.
Yeah.
And then she lost her contact with that group that did that transforming but we did the videotaping for about 2 or 3 years after John couldn't manage the stairs any longer, and so we took over.
And it had to be, what was it? It was transferred to 16 millimeter?
Yes.
They wanted it on. Who would have thought you were having to transfer the program to 16 millimeter to deliver it to public television?
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't understand that either.
Well, they had a projector that they could get a better picture from that projector than they could from a video system. you know, that was a long time ago. We
So,
had
so let me put in a plug here for gay people in the law. We had 20 minutes left over in our time slot. So I filled it with a law program that
I remember that now.
Oh, yeah.
called Gay People in the Law, and I was on for a long time putting on that gay law program.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Did you notice? Did you guys notice any like impact from broadcasting the services online? Did it like increase attendance or change minds? Like what was some of the impact of that you know about?
Don't know anything.
I don't think we got that kind of feedback, Aidman.
Yeah,
Hopefully it did impact, and hopefully it even brought us some people. But I don't think we had a way of sort of knowing, like, you know, how you can, what would you say, you can, you know, now numerically you get some feedback, but we didn't get that kind of feedback.
You couldn't click on a button and say, I like it.
Why not?
we used to set up our VCR at home, and we would record it every week and enjoy it afterward too, even though we had been to the service itself.
Yes, that's right.
Speaking of services, we also had a tape and transcript ministry. So we made an audio tape of the service.
That's right.
And then during the week, I would listen to that tape and transcribe it to typewriter and print it up. And then we would make both of them available in the bookstore the following Sunday or two. And so what I found is that Reverend David was very pleasant to listen to. Okay, it didn't transcribe into the printed word very well. Because with the printed word you have to have commas and periods and parentheses and whatever, and those were missing from David's speech. You wouldn't tell just by listening to him. He had a very nice voice, but it took a lot of work to put his thoughts into paper, and that was one of the jobs that I had back in the day.
And David Farrell's version of that Michael just said is, David said, every uttered word that he uttered ended up on a piece of paper from Michael. So.
Well, the other thing that he had a stand-up comics timing, because he would tell you a little story, and he would get to this thing, like he was telling us about his new condo, and he said that he got up to check the roof, and he was checking this and that and the other, and then he'd kind of turn aside and put his hands on his hips, and he said, I felt so butch. But only he could put that off. I mean, on paper, that would be what? Oh, dear.
That's funny. Al, you have a question. Did you ever do drag?
I never did drag, no.
Yet.
That largely comes from a long-term standing saying. Michael knows who it is who would say something like this. There's somebody we know and care for who always has said concerning drag, ugly in is ugly out.
Oh.
Put an ugly man in and an ugly woman out of it. So no, I had no inclination. I wasn't that creative to be able to do that. No.
I like your honesty.
Yeah. I used to say though, and I meant to say it the other time, back to Sam and me, you know, I met this I like to say I met this hunky black dude with a voice to die for, and it was everything you could possibly imagine in a man. And so I married him. And I married him and found out I had married Diana Ross. That was fun. That was fun.
Al, do you want to tell us about the Dolly Parton scene in the Follies?
Oh, that's right.
Oh, I love that routine.
Yeah, that was probably the one that he's most remembered for. Sam
Yes.
is most remembered for his Dolly Parton routines. So one day, one of the Follies, he's doing 9 to 5 and bouncing across the stage. And when he bounced particularly hard, a boob bounced out and bounced across the stage. And it just brought the house down, you know, it just brought the house down. He lost a boob in that. And the remaining nights, 1 or 2 more nights, whatever it is, he tried so hard to make that happen. He never could make it happen.
So that was an early version of a wardrobe malfunction.
Yes, that's cute, Michael. That is a wardrobe malfunction. Yes. Yes.
Michael, you're so funny. You say the funniest things.
By the way, this occurs to me, Courtney, you're getting a whole new picture on this.
Look at her show up again.
Courtney, you're doing a whole lot of things about those pictures I shared with you that were so prim and prissy and pretty, and of Sam. Never know he lost a boob on the stage.
Oh, Al, I have a question, because this went before my time. At the 30th Street, the social hall was May Fulton Hall, and I don't know who May Fulton was.
Well, May Fulton was one of our very early women deacons.
Okay.
And she might have been the earliest, the first of the women deacons, May Fulton. And she came from a ministry of a street ministry of caring for the homeless.
Oh.
In some big city back east. I don't remember where that was, but May Fulton, yes.
What a wonderful thing.
Al, was she related to Reverend Gilbert?
No.
Okay.
No. Actually, the Fulton Hall was named for May, and it was also in memory of John Eberly's mother, who was also her name had been Fulton.
Oh, okay.
So the dedication plaque for Fulton Hall was May and John's mother. So,
okay.
But it was named for May Fulton. Wonderful woman. She was just wonderful. Yes.
So had she passed by the time Sandy and I came, or had she moved away?
Her health had failed. And she was not able probably to attend anymore. Maybe had already passed by the time.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Another one of the saints of MCC. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Did you just have an epiphany moment there, Michael?
Yes, I see the name Loveday Gilbert, and that's where I was confused.
Oh, Loveday Gilbert was Joseph's
John
mother.
Gilbert's mother. Yeah.
Right. Reverend Gilbert, yes.
Yeah. And
Mother's Day.
And June Norris was also another one that was such a wonderful woman who gave so much to the church. That was I loved when she preached. It was always such a kind feeling of what you should be as a Christian. And I could never figure out how people could claim to be Christian in one breath and then do something so unkind as picketing or that kind of thing. Yeah.
I think I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, she was the first straight minister of MCC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that right?
June Norris.
June Norris.
But Dan can tell us about some of the hymns that June Norris wrote. She wrote.
Oh yes,
remember.
the lyrics to the music. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us, Dan. I'll go look up some lyrics.
Dan probably knows that by memory.
Oh, really? Oh, you have it right there.
What are you showing? What are you showing?
I'm gonna. I can't unmute you.
Yeah. Yes.
I think he's. Are you looking it up, Dan, to share with us? Okay. I tried to.
His little head is nodding over there in the corner.
Mm-hmm.
Al, while we are waiting, can you tell us about the history of the church from the teaching aspect? How we graduated several ministers to other churches in the fellowship?
Yes.
That's right. We did. We had many people who went on to become clergy and to pastor other churches, didn't we, Michael? Do you remember?
Yeah. Yes, we did.
Oh, lots of them.
Ron G. was one.
Art Healy.
Dennis Chappelle.
Diane and Sheila Rawls, Diane Miller.
Correct.
The one in Hawaii. Jennifer Kwan. Yeah, Jennifer Kwan.
Yes.
Oh gosh. John Ellison was one, right? Oh, Ellison, obviously. Ellison.
Nathan Beckley. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And John.
The one that had the beautiful voice.
Yeah, John. Oh.
That was Nathan Beckley.
Nathan. Yes.
Yeah.
He's up in
San Francisco area.
Portland, Oregon.
Oh, Portland, Oregon. Okay.
Right, but we were talking about names from the early days.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I was just contributing what I know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, that's good.
So back to June Norris. The hymn that we most know that we sing at our church is "Joyful People Come and Worship." To the tune.
Joyful people, come and worship. Lift your heavy hearts to God.
Lift your happy hearts in song.
Happy hearts in song.
Oh, pretty close.
Pretty close.
Maybe it's changed since it was originally written.
Yeah.
Whereas my father used to say, close but no cigar.
No cigar. And she was somehow associated with butterflies, and so various stoles that remain at the church and come out a couple times a year with different worship participants have butterfly images or like lapel pin brooches type thing, and anything like that that has the butterfly on it belonged to or came from
I thought it came from Tony.
June.
And Tony carried it on. And the bullet hole in that window that was covered up with the little butterfly.
Yes.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. Now that's courtesy of Jesse Black.
Oh, really?
Yes. Jesse took the stained glass window in to get it repaired. It was broken in more than just that.
Yes.
We removed it from the 30th Street Church and stored it and so forth. But anyway, it was getting to be in kind of rough shape at that point. And much to her credit and her generosity,
Wow,
Jesse took the window in and had it refurbished by a stained glass craftsman. And when she brought it back, the bullet hole had been replaced with a butterfly, which was very thoughtful of Jesse to do.
And the history of that was when we were going through our fundamental transformation, basically in the early 2000s, 2000, 2001, and butterflies were a theme of Pastor Tony back then. And even that banner that's on the side of the church has got all the different butterflies from the what do you call it before the cocoon?
Maybe a
Caterpillar.
The caterpillar, to the cocoon, to the butterfly. And
Which banner?
The one that hangs.
There's a lot of
in
them.
the sanctuary by the ramp. No eye has seen.
Oh, okay, great.
All right.
I didn't know that connection. That's cool.
And that was hung initially up on 30th Street on one of the paneled walls next to the sanctuary or the pulpit.
Mm. Do you think we should get to the 80s at all?
I think we've been all over the place.
Okay, great.
Because I've been talking about the 80s because I didn't, when did we start?
We started in 84 and I started in 82.
Okay.
I actually went to Dignity first, and when you were talking about men to women, when I went to Dignity, I was the only woman.
Is that right?
And not only was I the only woman, but I felt so out of place because they had been battered by Catholicism and I had been in the convent. So I didn't feel battered. I didn't feel like I fit. So then I had a child in my classroom that had two moms, and I figured if she had two moms and she would share that she had two moms, I figured maybe they knew of a church. So I contacted them and they went to MCC. That was Melinda McKinney. Remember Melinda McKinney and Colette? Al, do you remember?
No, I don't remember them.
Melinda McKinney and Colette were in the Follies all the time. So they were kind of movers and shakers in the Follies too. And I thought maybe through Sam you would know them.
I don't think so. No.
She actually worked at a lumber mill. And so she was built like she worked at a lumber mill.
No stereotypes there, huh?
Well, speaking of that, Al, tell that story of how a woman pretty much saved your nose from a door being slammed in it at a bar.
You remember I told you we weren't all that well received when we went to those bars. And Pat and Sandy, I know you will remember from the Follies, Jan Marie, who made who made famous her skit with "I'm a Little Teapot," short and stout. Well, do you remember her wife was a woman named Andy, who generally wore battle fatigues, camouflage army battle fatigues, with combat boots. And what I like to say is I owe the fact that I still have a nose to the time, and I always had Andy close to me when we went bar hopping. I love having Andy with me. And there was one night that somebody tried to slam a door into my face, and that great big combat boot of Andy's came down just in time to stop that door. And I have always been indebted to Andy. And Jan Marie was wonderful. We all remember Jan Marie. Yeah. And she saved my face that night. I love Andy. Do you remember Andy?
Yes, I don't remember. I do.
All right.
You went there longer than I did. We had our first date to MCC.
I invited her to church. How's that for a keeper?
You're right. You're right. You never let her get away, did you?
No, first date, we were going to go somewhere, and I said, well, how about joining me at church tomorrow morning?
I'll bet Pat thought, whoop-de-doo, boy, this is I've met the dream of my life, and she wants to go to church.
Did they have U-Hauls when you first met?
No.
Utah halls, but we didn't have to have one.
No.
That's right.
No, but I'll tell you, when we decided to move in, I moved into her house because I had a pet and she had 2 pets, and my condo didn't allow extra ones. So the neighbors across the street from her were just drooling as I was bringing all of my power tools into the garage. And so we had 2 of everything, or 3.
That's the trouble when two dykes get together. We had 3 drill motors and 2 saber saws.
Right.
Oh, dear.
That's right. Yes. Talk about stereotypes, huh?
Yeah, that's right.
We were that.
Yeah.
And Al, when we had it was the MLK Junior Choir came to our church a few years ago, and you had a reunion with somebody back from Choice View, from the early days in the 70s. Do you want to share that story?
That's right. At one of the MLK Junior concerts at our current church, Pastor Dan came to me and said there's a member of the choir who remembered me from back in the days at Choice View, and she wanted to meet me and visit with me. So after the concert, I met with her and we were talking about the good old days at Choice View. And I learned something then that I always wondered about, but never really too sure about. And she said, by the way, Reverend Ed Hanson's decision to bring that issue to the board of directors, board of trustees, she said, it wasn't all that well received by the surprise. She said it was really not all that well received by the membership and by the board, but they honored his wishes to do that. And talk about situations where the Lord must be with you when you're talking about something. And I said, oh, well, I'll never forget the chairman of the board of directors. He was a wonderful guy, and I remember him so well. And he was, I think he ultimately became superintendent of the probation department of the county of San Diego. And I said, I remember him. He was just a wonderful person. I'll never forget him. Do you by any chance know Mr. Cecil Stepp? And she said, oh, yes, I remember Mr. Cecil Stepp. I'm the ex-Mrs. Cecil Stepp. Can you imagine that? I mean, I just happened to be talking to this guy's ex-wife, but thank God the Lord was with me, and I said all good things about everybody. No complaints. But she did share, it was a tough ministry of Reverend Ed. He sure put his faith where his courage was.
Yeah.
Yes, we owed a lot to him. Yes.
Something about, this isn't really with the MCC, but back when we were first together in the 80s, we used to have women's dances once a month. And unfortunately, the police raided one of them. Back then, I was in my 40s, and anytime you went into a gay bar, you'd have to show your ID to show you're over 21. And obviously, in my 40s, I looked like I was over 21. But they did that because of the police raids. and they would haul anybody off that didn't have an ID saying that they were over 21. So at this women's dance, the police raided, and a lot of the women were closeted, and they didn't want to have any their name published in the newspaper or anything, so they snuck out the back door. But that was the end of the women's dances. We didn't have another one after that. That was the end, and it was because of the police raid. And it was really stupid. There was this young woman, I think she went to MCC, who was going to law school. And so she was, she knew all about the law because she was going to school. And she had forgotten her ID. And so she went, there's a patrol car across the street back in the box or wherever it was. And she said, they won't let me in because I don't have my ID. And so that's what precipitated the raid. And I thought, well, how dumb can you be?
Yes, right. Yes. Dan has a question about what the other organizations in the gay community in the early 70s. And I think the Gay Center started maybe a year or so after MCC did. And that was an organization. There was Dignity, of course. And do you remember a group that was dedicated to older gays and lesbians called Sage?
Soul.
Sage.
Oh, Sage, yeah, Sage, yeah. And they also had Soul.
So Sage was seniors active in a gay environment. Mm-hmm. And then corollary, another group alongside them was Soul. And not that it applies to anybody here, but that acronym stood for slightly
older lesbians.
That's where I met Sandy the first time.
Is that right? It's Soul?
Yeah.
You met her at Soul? Wonderful.
Yeah, and she came with her lover, I thought.
It was just somebody who didn't have a car. And I had never been to the meeting before, and I went to the meeting. It was the most boring damn meeting I ever went to in my life. I never went back, and she kept coming looking for me, but I never came back.
And you met the love of your life at this meeting. Right. Never attended before. Yes, that's right. Yes. Well, I met Sam at Dignity at Christ the King, but I really met him when June and Jonas stood up and let him sit beside him. Yes.
Al, I heard it rumored maybe that you've been part of the Pride Parade and Pride festivities since the beginning of MCC. We've been 50 years as well. Could you talk a little bit about Pride in the first 2 decades?
Yes, right. Yeah, that rumor is true. I've driven every pastor of the church when we had a real parade with real vehicles in it. The very early ones, I believe, were just on the sidewalk because nobody could get a permit. I think couldn't get a permit to have a gay parade, so they paraded on the sidewalk. And then there was time that people had paraded with paper bags over their heads. But when we finally, the school teachers, I think, paraded that way. And so then when we had real parades, it fell upon me to drive the pastor. And I've been driving pastors in gay pride parades ever since. So we haven't missed a one. And the pastors have changed, but the cars have not changed. We've still got them. And this is going to be the first break in that 50 years of pride parades that we're not having one this year. So
it was so funny. I also belong to a group at San Diego State of the faculty and staff that were gay. And so we were going to march in the Gay Pride Parade for the first time, our little group. And I was going to go with them. And Sandy said, no, don't forget I'm a teacher and I'm a little bit afraid of what will happen. So I didn't. And who was on the front page of the San Diego Union Tribune showing the Gay Pride Parade but that little group from San Diego State?
Oh my God.
So, but then something else happened that we had on that coming out the first, is it the first Monday of October or whatever it is, the National Coming Out Day. They were going to have a mass marriage type ceremony at the Oregon Pavilion. And so I talked to the organizer. I said, now Sandy's a teacher and she doesn't want to have her picture on anything. And they said they're only going to photograph, they'll have the whole crowd, but they'll only photograph the individuals of the people coming down the aisle. So if you don't go down the aisle, you won't be photographed. So we were sitting way at the back and all of our friends from MCC were up at the front. And I said, including David and Gil and everybody.
Yes.
So I said, well, look at all of our friends are up in front. Let's go sit with them. Oh, no. We don't want to have our picture taken. I said, they promised that they wouldn't take our picture. So we're sitting up there and there's all the media's right in front of us taking pictures of the crowd.
Yes.
And so we had I'm an electronic junkie, I still am. So we had I think 3 VCRs in the house. So we set them all to record different stations. So we came home and we looked at one, it was fine, and we looked at the other one and it was fine, and then we went to bed, and the next morning she turned on the one that was in the living room and she screamed. Well, the picture, the few people that didn't go down the aisle included David and Gil and Sandy and me and a few others. We're just sitting there, and we're just kind of sitting like this, right? And watching this going on. Well, they liked that so well that they zoomed in on us, so we took up the whole screen, just our faces.
It was not the face.
Just the face.
Yes.
And her head's like this.
Yeah, and her head's like this.
Like this.
So, yeah. and so, well, that was fine. So that happened. Our custodian came up to me and said, "Oh, I didn't know you were like that, right?" And nobody else said a word to me. Her custodians did the same thing. He was the only one that said anything to her, but all these other people saw it. Nobody said anything. And then this was on the CBS station, Channel 8. Channel 8 liked that picture so well that they put it in their archive. And anytime there was anything about gay marriage, they would anything. They would show that. So if you didn't see it the first time, you had ample times. It was probably shown 10 or 15 times. And
Absolutely. You became the poster kids of the gay movement. You're trying to be in the closet.
But Sandy didn't lose her job, and it was just fine. So that was fine. So we didn't have any problems coming out after that because we were outed by Channel 8.
Yes.
So, Al, tell us about Proposition 6 and how it related to schools.
Right, and I was thinking about that when Sandy, you were talking about you had to be careful because you were a school teacher, and I think we need to remember that Prop 6 was a proposition that would cause even anybody suspected of being gay or known to be gay or thought to be gay could lose their jobs. And we need to remember that Pastor David led the campaign in San Diego County to defeat Prop 6. And we were a pretty conservative county those days. And David and his group of all of us banded together, and he literally managed the campaign to defeat Prop 6.
One thing I thought that was interesting about it was the 30th Street Church was right next to Carl's Jr.
Yes.
And that Carl guy was one of the main supporters of the Briggs Amendment. So,
that's right. That is absolutely right. Yes. And
So when we went to church, just before we got there, we would walk by Carl's Jr. and go.
and in those days, we wouldn't be caught going in there, no matter how hungry we were. And,
Nope.
yes, that's right.
yeah, I used to like Carl's Jr. until I turned into a lesbian.
When did
You
that
have to know something about Sandy and me, and that was that neither one of us had an inkling of the fact that we were gay until we were 46.
Wow.
Wow.
It's called naivete.
Denial.
I thought that I'd come out to myself when I was 30. So
Yeah.
I think I was born gay, so there was no epiphany telling me that I was gay. Everybody in the world knew I was gay, even when I thought I.
Well, I thought was really funny was somehow the San Diego Democratic Club figured out that I was gay, and they didn't even know who I was. Way back in the I think it was 1974 or something. It was before I went to Japan. We got I was married to my husband then, and we got this letter in the mail from the San Diego Democratic Club saying that they were forming this club, and it was mostly gay, and it was their formation letter, and they sent it to me. And
Wow. Wow.
And I didn't even have the foggiest idea that I was gay at that point.
Yes. Wow. Well, that was good. You haven't mentioned, Pat, but you have mentioned you were a part of the faculty at San Diego State. You were director of their computer center for a while, weren't you?
I was well, not the director of the computer center. I did a lot of systems programming for them, but I ended up directing the big computer lab they had. I set it all up and got it off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was it was really funny because that was before, well, the guy, San Diego State or any of the state colleges, when they build a new building, they get money for equipping the building. So some of that money went for buying all these computers. I think there were like 90 computers in this big lab. And what they had, but they didn't give them any paper or printers or anything like that. So this one guy that worked for the computer center found some old dot matrix printers and had one put on the end of each aisle. Well, by that point, everybody was using like image type of things, and so you can't do that kind of stuff on a dot matrix printer. So I ended up and they gave us two great big commercial laser printers, but no money for cartridges and no money for paper. So what I did is that I just created this money jar account, and I would charge them 10 cents for laser print. And so I ended up buying some inkjet printers so that they could use that anyway. And I paid for the paper and the cartridges and everything for the printers. So that worked out just fine until the administration found out about that, and I almost got fired because you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that. Well, I didn't know, and I was very careful not to make, like, I didn't have a cash register or anything. I just had a money jar because I thought if I did get in trouble, they'd see that it was very low tech.
Right. And it's more like tips or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
But back to church stuff, that's why I think she ended up on the committee to start a web page for the church. And she just figured out how to do it on her own and put up a web page and brought it to the committee, and everybody said, oh, that looks good. And So we even paid for that for what, about 5 years?
A long
We
time.
kept it going.
Yeah, more than that. I think
Maybe.
about 15 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. But see, time goes so fast when you're having
Yes, it
fun.
does when you're having fun.
But Pat, speaking of San Diego State University, Reverend David and I used to go out there on a regular basis and present, share with classes about the gay community.
Okay.
We were
Very
invited
nice.
in maybe graduate level classes. We would go out and we were examples 1 and 2 of what it meant to be gay. I don't know what kind of skewed idea that gave them. And we went to State College, and maybe a little bit later on went to some classes at UCSD. These would be maybe people working on masters in sociology.
Yeah, probably
like that.
Yeah.
And then to talk about how interesting that turned out to be, the chairman of the department, who was inviting us to come and appear in classes of his professors or his instructors, turned out to be M. Cummings, who, attends our church.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, right. Uh-huh.
A straight man and woman, M and his wife, and they attend our church sometime. And then another connection is one of his professors turned out to be Houston Burnside Sr.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Reverend Houston's father, Reverend Houston
Yeah.
Jr.'s father, was a professor in that department. I think one thing we probably don't know is Houston Sr. had a PhD, I think, and he was a professor, and his department head had a connection with us because David and I were going out a couple of times a year to speak to the classes in his department.
Uh-huh.
For the connection.
Yeah, we got to know Houston too, because I belong to the San Diego State retirees, and he would come to our functions. So I got double exposure to him. It was really nice.
Uh-huh.
And one of the psychology professors ended up asking his students to come and attend our church. And I don't know if you knew that or not, but I ended up having some of my faculty that were taking classes ended up at MCC, and I saw them in Fulton Hall after church.
Right.
So yeah, it was kind of interesting.
Amazing how interconnected we all
Yes.
are. Isn't it?
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Yes.
It's Fulton, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Fulton Hall. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the organizations from the 70s probably was the Greater San Diego Business Association.
Mm-hmm.
So
I was a founding board member of that organization, and what that brings back to mind is in those days, in the early 70s, in order to be sure that we could get ourselves, that we could acquire the 501c3s or the tax exempt or get ourselves incorporated, we had to come up with another word, a code word for gay. So the G in almost all those organizations was a code word for gay. And it was we named that one the Greater, what is it, Michael?
San Diego, GSDBA, Greater San Diego Business Association.
Yes, that's right. And SAGE was seniors, and we called it in those days, Seniors in a Good Environment.
Uh-huh.
In order to get our 501c3 without running afoul of anything. And it's so wonderful now we can call it what it is, we don't have to use the euphemistic G word. something else, you know. Yeah.
So the AIDS crisis hit in the early 80s, I believe, pretty strong. Did it hit in the community first, or how did it impact the church, as you remember? And then if you could then also talk about the AIDS vigil, the 24-hour prayer vigil that started, and then what became of that.
Right, and as I was pointing out to Courtney recently when I showed her a picture that I think Courtney has now of the Joyful Noise Choir at that time under the leadership of Terry Wheeler. That was a choir that was largely, completely lost to AIDS. Most of the people in the choir died of AIDS-related or AIDS, it seems like. And we lost about, maybe Pat and Sandy might know, we lost a large number of the men attending services. Is that right, Pat and Sandy?
Yeah. Freddie Stan, the one that gave us the grand piano.
That's correct.
And I think he was in that chorus too.
Right.
But I remember that, oh gosh, I'm getting bad at names now. I can't seem to remember a lot of names.
Right.
But there was a couple that used to sit in the front. They did the floral arrangements. Ron, I can't remember his last name, but he actually gave a sermon, really powerful sermon. He had an opera singer sing a song for us as part of the service. Do you remember that? But he had us number off 1 through 10. Went through the whole church and everybody numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then he had everybody who was numbered 1 through 8 stand up and walk over and stand at the wall. And then he said, now look back at the pews, and that's what this church will look like in another 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it was so, oh my God, it was just, I still tear up every time I think of it, because I looked out there and it was right. It was literally more than half of the men in our church were lost to AIDS.
That's right. And Pastor Dan just pointed out to me that Freddie, when we knew him in those days,
Freddie.
He was Ben Dillingham's spouse.
Yes, and every time he would go up to receive communion, he would touch the piano.
Right. Ben, Freddie gave that piano, and there's a dedication on the piano.
On the piano,
And you're right. And when Ben would take communion, and he would remember Freddie, but Ben also gave us another grand piano.
Yes, he did. The one that was at their home, I believe.
I believe so. So again, interconnected that way. Freddie, and he was lost to AIDS, I think, and then there was Ben, and of course we all know that Ben, along with an early veteran of World War II, their combined bequests to the church permitted us to pay off our mortgage on the church.
Right.
We own the church debt-free through these generous bequests of Ben and Fred Hammond.
Fred
Hammond, yeah.
Now, during that AIDS crisis, there was at least one funeral every week.
Oh, yes.
And I don't know how Reverend David was able to do it. There was even a time that he married a couple and then buried them a few years later. But we were having at least one funeral every week.
And one of the fallouts of that is all of us, but David and friends and loved ones, we really didn't have time to grieve.
No.
Because we were at another funeral.
Yeah.
You know, it was just horrific. It was just overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I think, why Pat and I, with this pandemic that we're having now, why it's striking us so hard, because you have to have lived through something like that and seen what it does. And there were so many of them that were so ill that for their own protection could not have visitors, because you would bring in other diseases and they were so susceptible to any disease you had. If you had a cold, they got a pneumonia. So, you know, we couldn't really say goodbye. We couldn't really be with them. And so many of them, what was the name of the fellow that bought our hymnals for us? The beautiful
Bob
voice.
Hatton.
Bob Hatton. Oh, what a beautiful voice. He made us a tape of him singing all of the hymns that we love. And he made that for us before he passed. And then we had the AIDS quilt, and we had, oh gosh, I was trying to think. We had maybe 3 or 4 choir directors that just bing, bing, bing. We'd have them for 6 months and then they were gone. And we had the quartet that always sang. And one day he was at church and he was just fine. And he died the following Thursday. He wasn't even ill and he was just gone. It was so sudden and so fast, and God, that was just a horrible thing.
Michael, do you remember the name of those guys that were in the quartet and in the choir? You remember?
Okay, the one that did the floral arrangements, Ron, the one that used to sing, when we sing, you know, that saved a wretch like, they would always, saved a wretch like me, and they would say, we're saved a wretch like you, and they'd point at each other. So every time we sing that song, I think of them. I can just see, and it was so, his partner was HIV positive too, but he never really got bad symptoms. He just kept on going, and he took such good care of Ron, but I cannot remember.
Well, one of the people was Wayne Faber. I remember Wayne. He was part of the quartet, Wayne Faber.
No.
And Rusty was part of it.
Yeah.
I remember. Michael went looking for it, but it looks like you didn't find it, did you, Michael?
Well, I thought I had a list from back in the day, and I just couldn't find it. It must be in the other room.
But I know one was Wayne. You remember Wayne Faber, don't you? And then
Yes, Rusty.
He was a tall one. He was bald. He was the one that did the floral arrangements. He did the floral arrangements for at least 5 years. Maybe from 1982 to 1987. And he never missed church. I mean, he was so frail he could barely get there.
And then after Ron died, Hal ended up with another guy who ended up with AIDS too. And he moved to Alpine. That's the last time I heard.
Yeah, Hal. Yeah.
You remember them now? You remember them now?
I remember Hal, and I remember the other one, but I can't remember his name.
Yeah, Ron. His first name was Ron, but I can't think of his last name. But he did, that was such a powerful sermon. Yeah. And such a powerful time. And this saying, you know, the social distancing and the sequestering and all of the stuff that they're doing, it seems over the top to somebody who's healthy and young and can't go to work and is hard pressed for money. and we can sympathize with that, but we can also see the handwriting on the wall. That if we hadn't been doing this, we would be just devastated by this disease. What was it in Italy? 900 deaths a day for day after day after day after day.
Right.
I just can't even imagine going.
Now we're worse off than they were.
Yeah.
And it's like Pastor Dan said in his opening words. People seeing this archive of what we're saying here today, years from now, will remember that was during the pandemic of 2020, that what we're talking about. But
Yes.
this was an epidemic of the 80s.
Yes.
The AIDS epidemic. And I remember one of the things that was said was when you would go to say that somebody had AIDS, you would basically just say, he's been diagnosed. You didn't even have to have
You
an
didn't have, no, yeah.
object to the verb. You just said diagnosed. And
then later it was just he's positive.
Yeah.
I heard in my membership class that a lot of the lesbians at the time stepped up to help a lot of the gay men that were sick. Can you speak to that, Pat and Sandy?
Yes, there was a lot of blood donations and a lot of things that the lesbians did step forward to help wherever they could. And I know we visited some in the
I think they called us the Blood Sisters.
They did.
Blood Sisters, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
That's really
Well, remember, even to this day, gay men are prohibited from donating blood.
That's right. Yeah.
And one of the things too, that men quite often have hemophilia, and one of the things that a lot of people didn't realize, but in Paris, and I think all throughout France, when you had hemophilia, you have to have blood platelets transfused, and it means you have to have tons of blood that make the platelets that are then given to you. And every single solitary hemophiliac in France died of AIDS. 100% of them. And that was something that was kind of, it wasn't really publicized, but the ones who were hemophiliacs in this country did get AIDS. And we had I don't remember, if you remember the little boy, their last name was White.
But I thought he got that from his dentist.
Oh, that was a young girl in Florida.
Okay, yeah. Ryan White.
Ryan White, and he was a hemophiliac. And he got AIDS. And they treated him so badly in school that he actually had to be homeschooled after that.
Yes.
So yeah, it was not a pleasant time.
Very heavy. Very heavy.
Very heavy, and it still is. I mean, I know there's the cocktails and things that give you a fairly good life and a longer life, but it's still a very bad disease, and it's really hard to get people to understand that a disease is just that. It puts you at a dis-ease. It makes you less comfortable with yourself when you have to fight this constantly.
I can remember when some of these conservative Christians would say that AIDS was God's punishment for being gay, and the answer to that was, well, obviously, God hates gay men, and then he hates men more, and then he hates men, but he loves lesbians. They never get AIDS.
Never. And there's nothing in the Bible that's negative about lesbians. It's only men.
And I think we took it a step further and said that lesbians was God's chosen people.
Oh, that's right.
God didn't give lesbians any of these diseases. And, yes, that's interesting. Yeah, that was terrible to label people that they had this terrible disease because God gave it to them, and it was his.
Yeah, well, Dorman Owens and his crew would have signs like that too.
We even talked about this last night at the Bible study about, it was John chapter 9 where Jesus heals the man blind from birth. And when the disciples are asking, was it his sin or his father's or his parents?
Yeah.
And we were talking about how the assumption behind that question is that issues in the body are a punishment for behavior.
Yeah, right.
and is that even true? Like, does God actually punish us for things that we do, or does God not? And just this conversation was reminding me as well, like, there have been people who have blamed natural disasters on gay people.
Yeah, they blamed 9/11. They said 9/11 was because of all the gay people in New York.
Right. It's absurd.
Yeah, or New Orleans when they had the Katrina.
Right.
They blamed that on all of the Paul de Ra that goes on in Fat Tuesday. You know, if you have a carnival, you've got to be bad people, so they're gonna. And I think, oh, get a life, God.
Well, there is that, right?
I wanted to ask Lee Bowman, if Lee, weren't you actively involved in another MCC, like in the Rockies or somewhere?
Oh yeah,
Denver.
I was there for like almost 20 years.
Mm-hmm. MCC in Denver, right?
MCC of the Rockies, yes.
Yes. You were very active there in that church, weren't you?
Yeah, I was on the board of directors for about 10 or 12 years, and then I was administrator for about 4 years.
Mm-hmm. And who was the pastor? One of the elders.
It was Charlie Earhart, and I'll never forgive Charlie for this. He hired me on as administrator, and then like 3 months later, we're out walking, and he said, "You know, Lee, I think I'm going to retire."
That reminds me of the story when I first came to the church. Right after I came, a couple weeks later, Pastor Dan said he was leaving to go to a pastor church in Colorado. I forgot what it's called. And then a few weeks after that, Pastor Tony said he was leaving. So I said, what is it? Is it me or what?
Right, yes.
But Pastor Dan decided to come back, so I forgive him.
That's right. Well, Lee, you were very active with Tony's ministry at another church, weren't you?
Oh, well, yeah, after Charlie Earhart left and retired, the first time he retired, our interim pastor was Tony Freeman.
Uh-huh.
And so I worked with Tony. It was over a year, between a year and a half that I worked, obviously very closely with Tony. So that's how I got to know Tony, and that's in part how I ended up here.
That's right. One of the greater legacies of Tony's ministry is we got Lee Bowman.
That's right.
Yeah, that's what Pat and I always say, that Tony stole Lee.
We're going to keep them as long as we can.
I see that.
We are going to keep Lee. We're not going to let him go. We're going to hold on to Lee. Yeah. What would life be after Lee? Yeah. We love you, Lee. You sure.
Oh, thank you. But no
Yes,
one is expendable.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I just want to acknowledge it's 2:27.
Okay.
And we've done very well to fill our time. with wonderful conversation and storytelling and questions. I've really enjoyed it. I liked you speaking, Al, to a lot of things, and then I've also really enjoyed the kind of conversation style of everyone sharing and contributing. So much history and experience and knowledge and goodness in this church.
Thank you, Cademan, for putting this all together for us. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
We do have 2 more coming up. So next week, there is no session. And then the week after, which is the 28th, we'll cover the 1990s through the 2000s. And then on the following Thursday, June 4th, right before Anniversary Sunday, we'll finish up with the 2010s into this decade and now. So I think what I'm going to do, because multiple people had challenge with pre-registering, is not require that for the future, just require the password, but I'll send it out to you.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So you don't have to do anything. I'll send you the link and the password, and we'll, I think that'll be easier and probably let more people participate.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Any final comments or gratitudes?
And thank you, Pastor Dan. Thank you. Thank you for everything.
Well, yeah, I want to thank you. And I want to, this was the brainchild of Courtney Harmon. And so I give credit to her for this. And so thank you, Courtney. And I know that you were able to have your head down and you were writing so many things. We still got to see your smiling face. Oh, wow, look at that.
Squeeze it into the booklet.
Oh, yeah,
I don't know if you guys saw the comments, but she suggested maybe she'll format the booklet to resemble the prodigal.
Yeah, we'll cut and paste.
Cut and paste.
It's when cut and paste really meant cut and paste.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pasted it.
Well,
Yeah, I want to thank all the main speakers, Al, Michael, and Pat and Sandy, for all their knowledge and wisdom and stuff that went on back then, right when I was a kid and didn't know all about the stuff.
it was quite a time back then.
Yeah.
One thing I did not mention was there was, I think it was probably one Easter Sunday, because there was only street parking in the neighborhood, all of our tires were slashed.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Was this at Fern Street?
Yes.
That's just hurtful. Like, it hurts to be treated that way. It's unbelievable.
Reverend David used to keep the rocks on his desk, formed it into like a pyramid, all of the rocks that were thrown through the windows.
And finally, a manhole cover was thrown through the window, wasn't it, Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that, yeah.
A manhole cover.
Yes. So, Pat and Sandy, I want to thank you for returning to San Diego from Hawaii. I noticed you had a Hawaiian background when we started.
I love the way
Sandy was fading in and out of that one, so I can see her now.
Yeah.
There we go.
They're shining now.
This is actually Kyoto, Japan.
Oh, Japan.
Oh, sorry.
Courtney, is there anything you need clarification on or anything you got a good experience today?
I've got your numbers.
Great. Awesome. Well, feel free to share with other people your experience today and invite them to participate. You can direct any of them to me for like just logistical information in the tech side of things. And we're really doing our best to make this as accessible to people as possible. And it's still, technology still gets in the way of many people participating. So thanks for being here and being flexible and patient and all the wonderful things.
And thanks for you, Kevin, for all the stuff you're doing on the tech side of things for Sundays, and it keeps improving a little bit at a time.
Yes.
Even then we have problems, but that you can't foresee, and so we appreciate all your work on that.
Thank you. It is a labor of love. So Dan, what do you think about closing us out in prayer?
I'm happy to.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Well, loving God, thank you for the great foundation that we heard about today, that we stand on 50 years later. By your grace and by the generosity and by the strength and the tenacity and the whatever it was, the chutzpah that all these people had to keep on going. Thank you, God, for them. And thank you for this church. Be with us now. Keep us safe. Keep us smart. Keep us healthy as we go our separate ways. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.